Handle it, yeah.
Meeting is now streaming live on YouTube.
Yep, so you guys are live.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. My name is Anita Riddle. I'm an alumni from Arizona, 1980. I would like to tell you about this alumni lecture series that the National Youth Science Camp Alumni Association is hosting. We do this periodically, and we're very happy today to have Dr. Tom Langen. He is an alumni from my year, very proud. He is also professor of biology, the Associate Dean of the Lewis School of Health and Life Sciences for Clarkson University in Potsdam, New York. He has taught biology, animal behavior, ecology, conservation science since 1999. Tom specializes in field-based environmental education, and he teaches courses in the Adirondack Mountains and in New York, upstate New York, and in Costa Rica. He is a specialist in applying problem-based learning, big data analysis, and citizen science data in his programs. Dr. Langen has a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Purdue and a Ph.D. in Biology from University of California, San Diego. He was a 1980 National Youth Science Camp delegate from Indiana, and he now serves on the Board of Advisors for the National Youth Science Camp Alumni Association. Let us welcome Dr. Tom Langen.
Thank you, Anita. Very nice to be here, everyone. You know, it's been a long time. I think you can hopefully see the slides, and you can see right here, you know, I'm this guy right here with the long hair in 1980. I've come a long way since then in those 45 years. I got my degree at Purdue in biology and then went into the Peace Corps in West Africa and Burkina Faso for a couple of years. Worked for Bristol Myers for another couple of years. Got my Ph.D. at the University of California in San Diego, working on animal behavior in Costa Rica, particularly behavior of birds. Then did a postdoc at UCLA, where I worked on avian cognition. And I've been at Clarkson University now for 26 years. And what I'm going to talk about today is sort of my journey at Clarkson University in one of the areas that I do research. So my research areas include environmental management or habitat management for endangered species, understanding public-private partnerships for conservation, things like conservation easements, and linear infrastructure, which I'm going to talk about today, mitigating the environmental impacts of linear infrastructure. So what am I going to talk about? Well, this is how it started. I moved to northern New York, the St. Lawrence Valley of New York, and just starting in my new job at the university, I noticed driving the roads at certain times of the year, I would see things that looked rather like this. So what you can see, each of these spots in here is a dead frog. There are thousands of dead frogs along the stretch of road on this particular day. You know, and I was appalled. I would drive at night and see just the road looked like leaves were going across. And it was frogs being hit by vehicles. And I talked to people and they said, oh yeah, it's always been like this. You know, it's always been this kind of problem. And it intrigued me and bothered me. I thought this is something that we must be able to do something about. So I immediately started working with some students, a group of undergraduate students, to try to document what the toll and roadkill was for reptiles and amphibians along the roadways in northern New York. And about that time, I stumbled across a book called Road Ecology. This is really the first book that focused on the issue of how roads impact the environment and what we need to study and learn in order to reduce those negative impacts. So what I'm going to do is take us on sort of a drive to understand what kind of work I do. So to start out, what is linear infrastructure? It's railway lines like this one over Nairobi National Park in Kenya. It's canals, which divide up the environment, like these canals in Spain, or if you're in California, you'll be familiar with these. It's roadways, sometimes with wildlife passages, like that's what we're seeing right here, others without. It's also utility corridors, gas pipelines, electrical power lines, everything that sort of divides up our world. And so you can see in an image here, you can see power line corridors, you can see roads, you can see that the environment is divided by linear infrastructure. Here's a national park that I work in Costa Rica. Again, you can see different kinds of roads and power line corridors that divide up the landscape. Here's the landscape in my area, the St. Lawrence Valley. And again, you can see that the dominant feature in the landscape are roads and other kinds of linear infrastructure. So why does it matter? Here's an image of the density of roads across the United States. What you can see is that roads are everywhere, and there are very few places that are black. Black are areas that are rather distant from roads. We have a vast network, a net across our country. And if we look at the world, we see the same. All of these red are major roads. And you can see that outside of the Arctic, the Sahara, the Gobi Desert, Amazonia, and a few other places, everything is covered with roads. Here's the US and the average distance you are to a road within the 48 contiguous states. If you fell out of an airplane with a parachute, hit the ground, randomly somewhere in the US, on average, you're going to be within 300 meters or 1,000 feet of a road. Roads are ubiquitous. Moreover, just the area of the United States that's covered in road decking is equal to the size of South Carolina. So if we think about different kinds of ecological communities, the road itself, in road and the road verge around a road, is a dominant kind of land cover. About 20% of the US is impacted directly by roads, either within the roadway or the nearby road verge. So what are the ecological effects? Well, the one that we all know about is roadkill, right? Animals that get hit by vehicles, and something that you see frequently. But it's also toxification. Here in the Northeast, it's road salt, but it's also metals from car tires and wear of vehicle parts. It's garbage that gets tossed along roads and many other things. It's habitat alteration and loss. You lose habitat by building roads, but then also the effects of the contaminants of roads continue to affect things. It's altered microclimates. Roadways are hotter, drier, windier, more arid, and that changes the climate from other places, like, for example, within a forest, like on this rainforest tract. It brings access. People can set fires, burn, fish, hunt, build homes along roads. They can create a way that humans can go in and access backcountry areas or interact with wildlife and interact with the local environment. And one of the most important is it creates barriers. It prevents animals from moving from one side to another. It's hard to see here, but that's a poor little bear cub that's gone through this Jersey barrier, and here's its mother trying to reach it. So that barrier effect can split populations. So the three big questions in road ecology, the ecological study of roads, are: what are their environmental impacts or their environmental effects? Where and when are these impacts most severe? And what can we do to avoid or mitigate the negative impacts of roads? Here we have a wood turtle. It's actually a female wood turtle. You can see some eggs. She was going to nest and she was hit by a vehicle. Here I've got a figure with lots of little pointy things. This is looking at where the most dense, the highest density of roadkill occur along a roadway. Here is a passage structure under a road that's allowing a turtle to walk under the road safely. So a kind of mitigation measure. So we're going to start with what are the environmental impacts of roads. and with an autobiographical approach. And what I mean by that is how I've worked on these different topics. So here I am about 10, 15 years ago, under a box culvert in Costa Rica under the Pan American Highway, where I'm looking at animal passage structures under roads. Now, the first really big project I worked on roads was the effects of road salt and road salt contamination. Salt is one of the contaminants that continues to go up in use in the US. We use it as an anti-icer and a de-icer. And we can find that, for example, along the Hudson River, the White Mountains, and other places, road salt concentrations are salinizing water. Water is continuing to get a little bit more higher chloride levels over time as more and more salt is applied. So I worked on a couple of lakes called the Cascade Lakes. Here's a road along that Cascade Lakes where heavy salt use. This is in the Adirondack Park. This plant right here, some dogwoods, you can actually see salt contamination. And what we found there, and on this stretch of road, over 200 metric tons of salt is applied a year. And all of that salt is going into the waterways. So what are the impacts of that, and what can we do about it? Well, one of the things that was noticed about it was that there was a dieback of trees and changes in the soil. So we actually looked at that. I led a team looking at salt, the soil, looking at tree growth, looking at water quality. One of the things that we found is that the soil along roads where there's high road salt use loses most of the nutrient cations that trees need to grow. Chloride levels and sodium levels are elevated compared to, say, a little distance from the road. And things like calcium, magnesium, and potassium are lost. Basically, roadside soils become sterile and with a structure that can prevent the growth of trees. And the tree dieback that we saw was because of that. We looked at fish in the lake. Here is depth for 2 lakes showing salt concentrations. And what you can see, and this is from January through June and back into January, 2 years, you can see that high salt levels at the bottom of the lakes, especially one of the lakes, particularly loading in the summertime, which is odd for road salt considering it's applied in winter, but it actually represents groundwater discharge. So salinization of the lake that's affecting life in the lake. One of the things that we find is, of course, it's far more elevated. In fact, at the lower Cascade level, the salt chloride levels were 118 times higher than a background lake in the Adirondacks. And that changes the microbial pattern of the lake. It changes the insect populations, and then that ultimately affects the fish. So salt levels that are changing the ecology because of the use of the roads. We actually modeled with current policies what the long-term effects were and could show how it would be changing the lake ecology over time. And ultimately, we came to some solutions. And one of those was revegetating the roadway with a native salt-tolerant grass called spartina or cordgrass. So we've done a revegetation project, which reduces some of the impact in terms of on the soils and also on the water. And we were able to push through a policy or get the Department of Transportation to adapt a policy that would reduce that would reduce the impacts on the lake. And that's been done. So that's a case where we did a little bit of science that made a big change in policy, thankfully. Another project we've been working on, is looking at overall patterns in North America of the populations of amphibians, and particularly amphibian declines that might be caused by roads. And so this was a project where we use citizen science data, basically communities, people who went out and recorded all of the frog species that they heard with a very structured kind of survey all over Eastern North America. This was called the North American Amphibian Monitoring Program that was run by the U.S. Geological Service. And so we took that data, and at 9 colleges and universities, students analyzed the data, and then we put that together. We used geographic information systems to analyze things like land use and land cover around the points where the frog populations had been surveyed in all of these states in the East and in the Midwest. And then we got together with our students in Santa Barbara at the National Center for Ecological Assessment and Synthesis, and we looked at what kinds of patterns we can explain in terms of amphibian population declines that might be associated with roads and road traffic. And so there's a lot of heavy statistics that I'm not going to bore you on today. But what I'm going to tell you is we did some modeling, right? We took some data and then looking at the using geographic information systems to quantify like what kinds of habitat or land cover and land use there is, what kinds of roads and other things. We could use that to analyze those patterns. And we did different kinds of model. This is called a structural equation model or a path analysis model, where we could look at the different factors that are all interrelated. And what did they tell us? They told us that traffic causes the greatest role in species loss. Roadkill, there's a role for roadkill that is in determining loss of amphibians, frogs and toads in particular, across North America. Road density and habitat changes also affect. Indicates that the barrier effect of roads might be important and impacts on habitat alteration. If we looked at individual species rather than all the frogs and toad species together as a whole, we see similar patterns. And one of the things we were concerned with, that you have to be concerned with, is our spurious effects. And one of those could be traffic noise. You're going to hear fewer frog species if you're next to a road that has lots of road traffic. And so there's ways to statistically factor that out. And we did that and found that still, even if we factor out traffic noise, it's traffic and road density that explains the disappearance of species of frogs and toads, or at least is correlated with it, we should say, across Eastern North America. We also found some other things that were kind of interesting. Some is that at higher road densities and in more developed regions, there's fewer species, and at every spatial scale. So one of the things I do is landscape ecology. So you can ask the question, for example, how important is the land cover and land use very close to a point you're at, like 300 meters? That's kind of the local level. You can also talk on the big level, like the 10 kilometers around. That's the landscape. And so what we find is even from small, like right next to a point, to the 10 kilometers around the point, the more development there is, the fewer frog species there are. This line right here means that there's the same as what you would expect. A point with a confidence interval below that means that there's fewer. So at any scale of development, from the local to the landscape, there's fewer frogs with more development. Probably not too surprising. Impervious surface is another way to measure that. You see the same. Here's road density. Whether it's how many roads are right around a point that you're surveying for frogs, or if it's how many roads there are, the density in the 10 kilometers around in the landscape, you see fewer frogs in those kinds of places that are heavily roaded. Agricultural areas are associated with fewer species, like in landscapes that are agricultural, but only at the largest level. So the amount of agriculture at 5 or 10 kilometers around a point matters, but it doesn't matter how much agriculture there is right at the local point, the local spot of where you're at. The more wetlands, of course, the more species you have. And that's what you see here at any landscape. whether you're close to a wetland or whether you're in a landscape with lots of wetlands. Also, bigger roads have bigger impact. So all of it is pretty logical, but we can show that using the citizen science data and having students analyze that data and at different spatial scales. Now, one of the areas that I work in a lot is on turtles and roadside wetlands. So there's lots of reasons to think that there's a decline in the abundance of turtles globally and in North America that's driven in part by roadkill, road mortality of turtles moving into roads or being prevented to getting to habitat because of the barrier effect of roads. So I have had a team of students working on and off for years on this. And so we've looked at a couple of things. So here is some data for two small stretches of road, the amount of roadkill. These are a couple of places. Norton and T19 are just two road transects. And what it shows is if you estimate how many turtles are killed on this stretch of road, here is the snapping turtle, Chelydra serpentina. About 8 a year are killed on this stretch, about 15 a year on this stretch. Here's painted turtles. About 20 painted turtles are killed a year and 50 on this other stretch. That's terrible sounding, but does that really matter, right? I mean, there's a lot of turtles. Is really 8 killed a year? Does it really matter? So that's where you have to know something about the population size. So we were looking at population size as well. And so one of the things that we found is that if you look in these wetlands that are adjacent, so the yellow fits with this, green fits with this, the amount of painted turtles was about 90% below what you would expect from a density in a unimpacted population. So between 70 and 90%, depending on those. For the snapping turtles, between 70 and 22%. So they were a lot lower. They were depleted in those places. Moreover, when we look at the estimated population size and compared it to the roadkill levels, we could see where the problem was. So if we take, for example, here's the snapping turtle, 32 individuals is the estimated population size in the wetland, and we're estimating that about 15 are killed a year, right? That's half of the population for these long-lived animals. Here for Norton, 52 with 8. I mean, that's 20. That's a significant fraction. Similarly with the painted turtles. So a lot of animals are dying, relatively high number. In fact, it's enough to change the sex ratio. So for example, for snapping turtles, populations are overwhelmingly male. In this population, 25 males and 7 females. 35 males and 17 females. Why? Because it's females that go to roads to nest. So we've been studying roadside nesting. Here's a snapping turtle getting ready to nest along this road. So most of the roadkill is females, less so in painted turtles because both species move a little bit more. But overall, there's a problem. In fact, the only reason we think that these wetlands near the roads can continue to have turtles is because other populations that are more remote from roads are sources of immigrants that can repopulate. So that leads us to the question of when and where are negative road effects most severe? Where do we go? This map right here of New York, you can see the shape of New York State. That's 80,000 deer vehicle accidents that happened in a period of about 2 years. How do you determine the expected population density in abundance? And I think that refers to here. So the expected is based on what the density of turtles are in well-studied populations of the same kind of, at the same latitude in Michigan and New York that are unimpacted by roads. So we looked at the density at some populations that are well-studied that are unimpacted by roads. And we could figure out from the same area, based on area and density, how many we would expect to see. And we could compare to the ones that we actually do see. And the way that we estimate the population that's actually there is we catch turtles and we mark them. We release them, and then we keep capturing and remarking, and we look at the ratio of marked to unmarked turtles. I hope that answers the question. So these are all of the deer vehicle accidents. Here's some data that we collected from the New York State Department of Transportation showing patterns of roadkill in New York. You can see that deer vehicle accidents happen in November and December most frequently, but happen all year round. And you can see from the map, they happen everywhere. The only gaps are places where there's not roads. There's about 26,000 deer vehicle accidents a year in New York State. The average vehicle damage cost is about $2,600 for a deer vehicle accident. But with the overall cost, with other kinds of costs associated with that, like police effects and injuries and something, it's averages about $6,000 per deer vehicle accident. You can start to do the math. This is huge. There's about 5 deaths a year in New York State from vehicle deer accidents and about $156 million worth of damage. So insurance companies are very interested in wildlife vehicle accidents. So we've been looking at that. And so we've looked at deer. One of the things that you may not be surprised to hear is that most deer, the highest rate of deer vehicle accidents is at dusk. And most deer vehicle accidents happen at night. So at night, it's actually the rate is a little lower, but because night is a longer period than dusk, more total number of accidents happen at night. But they do happen in dawn, and they do happen during the daytime as well. So any time of day, there can be deer vehicle accidents, but most happen at night, and the highest rate is right at dusk. Now, it turns out that the moon has an effect as well. We found that the full moon has the highest rate of deer vehicle accidents. And it's not because people drive more on full moon nights, and it's not because people are doing crazy things on full moon nights. It seems to be driven by deer behavior. They're more likely to wander onto roads. They go farther distances. The least accidents are during a new moon when it's dark. Basically, deer roam about and roam into roads when there's more light. Now, the most interesting, one of our recent studies was looking at the effects of time changes. So we have a time change in the spring and the fall. And it turns out that the time change in the fall, right, that 1 hour shift, so it gets an hour dark an hour earlier, results in a big jump in the number of deer vehicle accidents. So the time change in October or early November, which corresponds with the deer rut, results in a big jump in vehicle accidents. And that's because that shift moves the traffic rush hour in most parts of the United States and Eastern Canada into the dusk period, where accidents are most likely to happen. So there's those policy effects of things like time changes can result in impacts on road vehicle accidents that have a significant health and economic cost. Now, a lot of my work has been looking not at deer, but at turtles. And so one way that we do that is we drive roads repeatedly, and we mark the locations of where turtles have been hit by vehicles. So we create a pattern of locations records, and we can use that with some statistical software to measure the relative density along a road network. And these really sharp high peaks are areas of high densities of turtle roadkill. We call those hot spots. And those hot spots then can tell us what are the kinds of things that are associated with places where turtles encounter roads. And we can build models from that. So using data like I just showed you, we do a lot of modeling, and we look at things like land cover and land use, the traffic volume on roads and other thing, and the configuration of roads. And we find what are the correlates with places where roadkill occurs. And basically, from a lot of statistics, we find things like this, which probably won't surprise you. So here is a typical place that is a hotspot for turtle vehicle accidents. A wetland on both sides of the road. It's important that they're on both sides of the road, so it's like a causeway with a very narrow verge going into a wetland, mowed, making it attractive nesting habitat with high traffic volumes. These are the areas where most of the hotspots occurred. And by us finding these sort of correlates of it by some statistical modeling, now conservation agencies and departments of transportations use these cues using a geographic information system mapping to predict where places for mitigation or places that are going to be hotspots of turtle accidents are, so that they can figure out where to focus mitigation efforts. And we do this for other animals as well. Lately, we've been doing this for Blanding's turtles, which is an endangered turtle in New York and is endangered or threatened in much of the East. We look at things like where they occur and where they don't occur, and we can predict then or look at what are the correlates of where they occur. And one of the big correlates is away from roads, because roads reduce their populations. And we can look at gaps within roads and where they're present to understand how the landscape is fragmented. And we can even detect genetic differentiation. So we look at genetics of populations and finding that how these barriers, some are natural and some are created by human activities, actually lead to genetic differentiation or genetic differences in populations. We've been modeling the movement of these turtles, so basically using computer models to predict how they might move in a landscape if we understand what kinds of landscapes they prefer to move in and what kind they don't avoid or don't like to move in. And by doing that, we're actually able to predict their behavior. And then by predicting their behavior, we can predict where they encounter roads, where problems might occur. And we have a data set of where we know turtles actually occur. And so we can validate that. So we've actually been able to validate these sort of predictive models of how animals move through the environment by using actual roadkill data, and then using that to create models where we can predict in other places over thousands of miles of a road network where the most sensitive locations are for different wildlife species. Finally, we work on things like different kinds of mitigation. Here's this passage structure. There's a turtle right there crawling underneath. And we can take our modeling, like I've just talked about, and then use that to predict where we might want to put barriers, like fences or walls to keep animals out of the roads, where we can put passage structures so they can go under roads, like this turtle right here, where we could put signage up to caution drivers or slow them down, where we can manage the verge to either make it more or less attractive to animals, and we can create behavioral offsets. This is a nesting site away from the road that's intended to lure the turtles, the female turtles, away from the road to another more safe place which they can nest. And so we've looked at the functionality of different kinds of fencing and found that fencing works for turtles, and that culverts work as passage structures. But we've also learned a lot of other things about what kinds of things work well and what don't. And so we make recommendations to the departments of transportation about best practices. We've done some design experiments. For example, believe it or not, some turtles, like snapping turtles, can climb. So we have to modify the kinds of fences we use so they can't climb over the top. They have to put a lip. So we test different designs, prototypes, and make recommendations there. We put together how-to reports for practitioners, that is for conservation agencies and for departments of transportation, on what they need to do to mitigate impacts on the environment. We have recorded talks. I've recorded talks to help, disseminate what to do. And we've putting together things like a database of all of the different kinds of mitigation in the Northeast. Been working on the Pan American Highway in Costa Rica. And I work in Costa Rica in a national park that goes from the ocean up into high volcanic mountains and is a natural migration corridor. Here's from this kind of work, we've been identifying what are the kinds of impacts of a road on a tropical national park. And what we find is that we can predict by different kinds of vegetation patterns where animals will cross. For example, you see these trees over the road. That makes a natural sort of corridor for butterflies and birds. If there's no trees going over the road, they tend to fly low and get hit by vehicles. But if you have a pattern like this, they actually will follow it and fly over the road and avoid vehicles. So we're looking at how you can use vegetation to reduce those impacts. There's a question. How do we make it safer for deer and bears as well? And those are great questions. For large mammals, it's the same kinds of issues. So fencing, for example, can work well. And particularly if you put them in appropriate locations to prevent the animals from going into the road. But if you put up fencing or other barriers, then they can't get to the other side where there's habitat that they need to go. So you need passage structures. And so one of the things that we think about is what kinds of passages are practical and effective. So for example, underpasses, under bridges, large culverts, like you'll see here in a moment, and other things that will allow animals to move under the road is one way. In some cases, building wildlife bridges over the road, wildlife passages to allow the animals to move over the road works well. In fact, right here, see these culverts. These were originally placed for water control, but they turned out to be actually natural passage structures. So we've been looking at this in Costa Rica as well in New York, finding places. Here's an amphibian that we're studying in Costa Rica that is affected by roads. But we find that road mortality for animals like these tropical mammals are reduced when you have these kinds of little passage structures that animals can use to go under the Pan American Highway. Oh yes, sloth crossings. So arboreal crossings for sloths also work for monkeys, iguanas, and other arboreal animals. They have lots of co-benefits. So those arboreal passage structures are really important. Arboreal ones are, then under the roads are. Here you can see some animals using that. And we've been looking at what are the shapes and types of passage structures that work best for different animals. Different species use different things. Some animals do not like to go into a dark place under a road. Other animals prefer it. Some animals like to go over the road. Some animals would prefer to go under it. So different species have different preferences. Now, the work that we've been doing in Costa Rica has become important because there was a move in Costa Rica to amplify or expand the Pan American Highway. So going from 2 lanes into a 4-lane road. And so from the work that I and others have done, we can anticipate what the environmental impacts would be of expanding that road. And they would be pretty devastating for the park, for connectivity and for migrating animals in the park. Based on the kinds of data that we had, the science that we've done about that, so far, the Costa Rica is committed to no longer expanding it through the at least through the park area. Although outside of it, they have widened the road into a 4-lane divided highway. So far, we've been able to avoid that kind of barrier, which would be devastating to this very important park. So a lot of what we've done in Costa Rica, and I can say that I organized the first workshop on the environmental impacts of roads in Latin America. The first one was in Costa Rica in 2007 that I organized. I've done several more. And then many of my students and other people that are associated, I've worked with, have done others as well. So we've done them in Chile, Guatemala, Mexico, many other places. And then people following through have continued on. So now there's a very mature movement in terms of road ecology in Latin America. And so doing a lot of professional development and training for practitioners. Here I am doing a field project in one of the areas, others in Chile. We've written books and book chapters on road ecology. There's annual conferences. Last week, I was at a conference on ecology and transportation. I'm doing the program for the next one, which is in 2 years in Portland, Oregon, and then a lot of public outreach. So how's my career going? Well, it's still going forward. Up ahead, what we're looking at is trying to understand more about how roads impact large continental scale connectivity in places like North America. So how can we plan so that populations of species can move despite road barriers shifting, for example, because of climate change? Doing more road ecology education in the Americas. Looking at behavior. And one of the things we're looking at now is both human driver behavior and deer behavior to understand how we can design ways that help people avoid having accidents with deer. And doing more writing for motivation and inspiration. So work like this takes a lot of people. So I have 104 or more co-authors on papers that I've written over my career. 5 graduate students have worked on this, over 100 undergraduates, 14 universities, 10 external funders, a lot of different places. So with that, I'm going to stop. Hopefully that was interesting, and I'd love to answer any questions that you have. Thank you. So let me know if you have some questions. Okay.
Well, Tom, I think that was absolutely fascinating. I didn't know turtles could climb. I'm very happy to predict the most likely places where deer and turtles cross roads. It's wonderful we have that amount of data and that you have people smart enough to analyze it and make those predictions. You know, it's like if you are able to do those predictions and save those species, that's amazing. Also, it's so wonderful that you know animal behavior so well that you can predict what types of crossings and passages that you can make that they'll actually use. I think that's fantastic. Very impressive work. Your career has been amazing. You're doing, you know, practical things that are, you know, helping biology that, you know, I hope that's what you, you know, you continue to do that and you've inspired lots of people to do that well. I think there are a few more questions.
Sure. And so the first is on the Wallace-Annenberg Wildlife Crossing under construction in California. That's a terrific project. Last week, I was with people who are involved in that. In fact, the photographer who made the great iconic photograph of the puma by the Hollywood sign, he was at the conference I was at. I met him. And they learned a lot about the design of that. I've worked in Southern California before that. This is, you know, one of the largest wildlife crossing structures ever built. It's built in an appropriate place with a lot of science behind it. And I think it's going to be a real model of how you can start to reconnect habitats. So for those who don't know, this is crossing one of the busiest interstates or busiest freeways in the world, and certainly one of the busiest in the US. And it's connecting an isolated mountain range, the Santa Monica Mountains in Los Angeles, with another mountain range across that are divided by the freeway, which goes right through a pass between them. So it will allow animals that are in one big block of native habitat to another big block. And then there's other plans for other connectivity going right up into the San Gabriel Mountains and then onto the desert. It was driven by concerns about mountain lions, puma, that were isolated in small, isolated populations, but it will help way more than just puma. Lots and lots of different small and large animals will be able to use that. Are you in touch with teams in other parts of the world doing similar work? Absolutely. There's a whole network of people who do what I do. And it's interesting and what I like about it is it's both scientists like myself, but it's also lots of different kinds of practitioners, engineers, civil engineers, environmental engineers, hydrologists, road planners, people who work with the public, departments of transportation, environmental groups. And so it's an interdisciplinary group, which you need for this kind of work. And we do a lot of networking. Of course, we do it a lot of Zoom calls, a lot of emails, a lot of sort of webinars like this. But it's a very, very networked kind of field. It's a question, what turtle mitigation can I take as a homeowner in coastal Maryland? We see snappers regularly. Well, there's the snapping turtles, and in coastal Maryland, terrapins are also a big species of concern. One of the things you can do is to make people aware, particularly during the nesting season, because the snappers you see are probably mostly coming up to nest, sometimes moving between wetlands, but for the other species as well, so that drivers are aware that they know what to do if there's an animal on the side or in the road. You have to be careful. People will sometimes do very dangerous things trying to save turtles, and they can get injured doing that. But you can safely move an animal outside of the road. If there's places where there's frequently animals near roadways, you can advocate from whoever is the agency that is the point agency for the road to put up fencing or other barriers that will prevent the animals from crossing into the roadway. When animals come up and nest, for example, in your yard or garden, just protecting those areas is good. Any thoughts on predator reintroductions as a way to keep things like deer populations lower and reduce vehicle collisions? Well, I certainly do think about it, and I think that having large predators, I think yes, that can play part in reducing that kind of risk. The trouble is that politically it's very difficult, there's a lot of social resistance to that. But in areas where you have wolves, puma, other large predators, prey species like deer are more cautious. They're less likely to roam large different distances from cover. And there's good reason to believe that they're less likely to spend time around roadways, especially if they feel vulnerable to predators. So I think predator introductions could potentially play a role, but I think at this time in most places, the social resistance makes that a very difficult sell.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Tom. That appears to be all of the questions. Really a heartfelt thanks from all of us at the National Youth Science Camp Alumni Association, of which you are a part, for your time and very interesting talk. Thanks very much. I do want to invite anyone who's listening. You are also invited to give a alumni lecture talk. Please email nyscaa@nysacademy.org, or you can send me a text, Anita Riddle at 571-581-4145 if you would like to get on our alumni lecture series. We'll do it about every quarter. So again, thank you very much, Tom Langen. We appreciate your time, and we mostly appreciate your work too. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And if anyone would like to know further about anything that I do or are interested in chatting with me, I think you can get my email and email me or give me a ring.
All right.
I'm happy to hear from you. Thank you.
Everyone have a good day, good evening.